Hello, my name is Heather Lester. I am a landlord tenant mediator with Utah Community Action. And I am here to talk to you today about the tenant toolkit that we have out there as a resource for tenants and landlords the same. The first chapter, we're actually just going to talk about three separate chapters, likely with more information in some of them than the others. But the main thing that we wanted to start out with was the first chapter, which is talking about how to be a successful tenant. So as you can assume, there's probably tons of things that help to be a successful tenant, and then sometimes they still may or may not work in your favor. So the main thing we like to try to do is to educate renters, especially in this time of unsurety and trying to figure out how to keep affordable housing, trying to maintain the housing that you do have. So some of the tools and tricks that we've had over the last couple of years when we've updated this book repeatedly, the main thing that we'd like to obviously ensure is the three basic prongs of any landlord tenant relationship. So understanding when you go into a lease or into any agreement, any contract, the main thing you need to understand is always the three elements, which is communication, documentation, and cooperation. And those are pretty obvious. Obviously, as I've taught this class repeatedly, especially in live sessions, it's pretty evident. But when you talk about communicating, you're going to communicate initially when you talk about the lease. You're going to communicate the terms. You're going to communicate the amounts. You're going to communicate any of the needs that you have, because you obviously are renting because you need something, and they obviously are usually a business, and so it's a business relationship with your landlord. Any documentation, that's why you obviously sign the lease. You have a lease that shows the parameters. So if everything's documented, you know exactly what the boundaries are on both sides. And then of course, cooperation. Cooperation goes a long way with any lease because obviously, you're paying your rent, you're communicating with them about any repairs, any needs, communication when you choose to end the lease. It basically goes throughout the process. A lot of the times when landlord tenant issues come up or people access this toolkit, it's in crisis or it's in a question or they're trying to determine tenant rights. And these, communication, documentation, and cooperation are used because they're trying to help remedy a situation. But knowing that you can have these skills at the time of the signing of the lease obviously takes it a long way too to build that good relationship. So being a successful tenant, there's several different processes through it, right? There's obviously the application process, leases and understanding leases, renting the unit, things to remember, good tips, understanding again that it is a business relationship, dealing with any problems, kind of responsibilities for the landlord, responsibilities for the tenants, and then just dealing with any of these things, whether it's a good tenancy, whether you end up having some issues throughout your tenancy. This chapter, specifically chapter 1, will actually help with this. So just diving in really fast, when it comes down to being a successful tenant, within the toolkit, obviously, there's several different things that you can look at. You obviously want to try to figure out what you can afford, understanding what's within the lease. There's a lot of questions that come about with, can they charge this, or are these issues, are these fees okay? The point of the whole thing is again, when you first sign the lease, is to review the lease in depth, right? You have to understand the amount of the lease. The main things, there's obviously several. Some leases are 5 pages, some leases are upwards of 20 to 30 pages. So there's 5 to 30 pages ish. The main thing is when you read the lease, it's not just the first couple pages that are important. The lease is genuinely important or it wouldn't be in there. So the parameters are usually what the rental costs, what goes into that actual rent cost, any fees that come along with it. Anybody that's listening to this, I'm sure, has had several different fees. Sometimes there's media package fees, or there's obviously utilities that are included. I'd probably list for days for the different types of fees that are in there, but you need to be aware of, number one, what fees, how much, when they're due, and then being able to navigate to show that that's within the budget, right? Because that's one of the main things, is figuring out how much you can afford. Rent is obviously high as it goes right now anyways. And so understanding those extra fees and those other obligations that go along outside of the rent, because those things you can actually get evicted for as well. So you don't want that. Obviously, where you want to live is important, meeting your landlord, depending on whether it's a private landlord or it's a small landlord. Either way, building that relationship with them is vital, right? To help remedy any issues that may come up, or just understanding rental time periods and how that falls in availability. So the the thing right now, and especially with people trying to find housing, is if it doesn't fit, like if it's too much money or outside of the rent, these fees are too much, sometimes you just have to move on and it might not be the right fit, and that's understandable. But understanding that the application is there, they do, depending on the parameters, there's really not a standard. Most places do credit checks, background checks, criminal background checks, and then obviously there's different systems that have um, the ability to pull previous evictions or other housing related matters, even if it's not through and on your credit report. Sometimes there's a confusion there, but just know that they have the ability to do that. Some choose not to, but tip for tip for tenants to make things easier, go in with an open disclosure. I don't think anybody has a clean slate. So when you try to rent something, everybody needs a home, everybody needs a place, everybody needs something stable. But if you open disclosure with your landlord at the beginning and say, I have these barriers, or my credit might not be as wonderful as I would like it to be, but not understanding those barriers up front and having a conversation, again, going back to communication, that will help you. And that will also help to not pay out a bunch of application fees in the instance that you're just trying to not bring up the inevitable, right? So just a tip, sometimes it doesn't always work out, but open disclosure from the beginning is very helpful. Other things as far as being a successful tenant, um, within the lease agreement, again, there's lots of things in there. We're going to go over several different options and different options, several different things and topics, because in the lease, there's the due date, there's the grace period, there are what to do in the instance of an emergency. Um, drawing a blank, what to do in the event of emergency, and then like what the late fees are, anything like that. Also within the lease, it's usually not within the first couple of pages, but usually within the lease, there are can they access my unit? What do I do in case of this? If I need to get out of my lease and I have to move for a job, or other options or other items, they're in the lease. If it exists, if it's a rule or a restriction or a guideline, it's going to be in that lease. So always just, go through the entire lease and at least read the lease in its entirety to make sure you know where these items are. But all the parameters, if it doesn't exist in the lease, then it usually falls to the Utah State Code for the balance of that. Most leases, again, that's why they're so long, do cover everything. So moving on, being a successful tenant, we mentioned dealing with problems. So when you deal with problems, it's there's usually not just one problem. Life happens, and especially when I teach these classes, I hear so many different stories and so many different issues that come up. I mean, landlords, whether it's a company or a private landlord, they have obligations as well. They're human, they get it, but being forthright and actually coming to them with the issue. Sometimes there's a pay or vacate issue where you couldn't pay your rent or you couldn't pay all of your rent. Especially right now, right? We're in a pandemic. I know these videos are going to go for a long period of time, but at the same time, right now is just having that communication and making arrangements. Come with what you have an option or a plan for what you don't. Pay or vacates is a longer discussion, of course, but there's other problems. There could be maintenance issues. There could be noise issues. There could be a nuisance issue against you or another tenant, additional guests. Um, Sometimes there's leases that have house rules as well, depending on the type of community. Sometimes it's not just your average apartment rental. Sometimes there are um, other housing requirements, certain maybe HOA requirements in the area you're in. Again, sometimes they call them house rules, but just making sure that you understand that those rules do actually apply. I mean, they're just like within your lease. They're given at the same time. It's just parameters that you need to follow. Um, the landlord does have responsibilities as well. I mean, they have to notify you if they're planning on coming in, if there's annual inspections, or just basically any type of inconvenience to you. They have a duty to make sure that that you know whether it's 24, 48 hours, 72 hours before they enter the premises, or if they're doing a review of maybe your income, depending on the type of unit. These things are notified to you as well. And that should also be in the lease. So you have those guidelines and they have those guidelines to follow too. So, so being a successful tenant, responsibilities go obviously first and foremost, above anything else, we always want to strive to pay our rent. Paying the rent obviously is your obligation because you signed the contract. Sometimes those things happen and sometimes issues come up, but the main thing is understanding that doing whatever possible, communicating whatever possible to get the rent paid, because a lot of things trigger for your rights as a tenant if your rent is current, or if you're in a payment arrangement or in any kind of an addendum. There's a lot of tenant rights that do come into place. If you fulfilled your part of the contract, then you can kind of hold them, the landlord, responsible for their part of the contract. So it does work both ways. And there are a lot of tenant rights that can be utilized. But again, it's just trying to figure out the best way and the best way and the most effective way to help yourself to keep your housing, to build that relationship with your landlord, so the relationship doesn't actually get ruined over an issue that maybe could have been communicated better. So in the instance, one thing I always like to mention too, if there's ever an emergency, there's usually a clause within the leases about emergencies. It's always a good measure to let your landlord know. Maybe not if you're going to go camping for the weekend, but you're going to let your landlord know if you're going to be out of town potentially for upwards of 3 or 4 more days. And the reason for this is sometimes there's emergencies. I mean, fires happen, floods happen. It's really, and I understand that sometimes we don't want to check in with our landlord. I say check in lightly, but check in with our landlord. But if these things happen, um, if anything should happen in your unit and your landlord has to access your home, then you want to be able to know that you're not responsible for that because you let them know that you were not there. So it's just a good rule of thumb. It's nothing to talk for another 15 minutes on, but just understanding back and forth the ability to make sure you aren't held liable for things that are outside of your control. Um, there's some information in the toolkit as well as far as like tenant safety and emergency preparation, all of those things. Uh, Further, so basically to conclude, as far as being a successful tenant, there isn't a fine line to toe as far as you're the perfect tenant or you have the perfect landlord. I think relationships go with person to person, situation to situation, and I see a lot of that. Trust me, I this is my job. This is what I do um, every single day, and I love it. But when it comes down to understanding how people communicate and how even in times of crisis or even in times of stress, everybody gets sick, people lose jobs, people have deaths in families. All of these things come into just life. And so, again, back to communicating, it's really vital that even if you don't have that personal relationship and you are maybe, say, apartment A 1741 down the block, it's still important that you communicate with them to let them know this is what I'm dealing with, even if there is no option and you don't get the result or the convenience that you wanted, understanding that you've documented everything you've tried to express, done the very best you could. And sometimes it is unfortunate, but evictions do happen. And, at that time, at least we can prove and show and demonstrate what you've tried to do to remedy and to not have an issue with your housing. Please feel free to refer obviously to this toolkit. It's very much updated. It was updated as of January 2020. Likely there'll be more updates as it goes, but please, definitely look through the first chapter, Successful Tenant. If you have any questions, feel free to always reach out to the Utah Housing Coalition I'm with Utah Community Action, and I do actually do some of these classes as well, online and also live in person. So feel free to reach out at any point if you have any questions that I can possibly answer if it's more specific to your needs. Thank you.